Perhaps no two words hold as much emotional weight in the horror game community than Silent Hill. In the late 1990s, Silent Hill on the PS1 ushered in a new era of survival horror, one that moved away from the schlocky B-movie style scene in games like Resident Evil and Clock Tower, and instead embraced a more psychological horror. The game emphasized atmosphere and storytelling over fast-paced action, and was a critical and audience hit, spawning a series with some of the greatest games in history, and some not so great. Silent Hill's influence is still felt in horror games today, but with its sequel Silent Hill 2 being held as the pinnacle of the series, the first game is often left overlooked. But after so many years, how well does Silent Hill 1 still hold up? And even more, in a new era of immersive horror games like Visage and Resident Evil 8, is the original Silent Hill still scary? Feeling nostalgic and curious, I went back to play this classic and answer that for myself. And over my 8-hour playthrough, I discovered that not only did Silent Hill manage to scare me over and over again, it's still one of the scariest games of all time. The story of how Silent Hill came about is sort of a miracle. Team Silent, the dev team behind the first 4 Silent Hill games, was created as a team of outcasts at Konami. It was made up of unhappy staff members who had failed in their other game projects, and many of them actually planned to leave the company. Wanting something that would be successful in the US, Konami ordered a game that would be a mainstream, Hollywood-style hit, a direction that left the crew feeling aimless and unsure on how to proceed. Feeling creatively restricted, ostracized from the company, and without hope, Team Silent threw Konami's suggestions out and instead started work on a surreal horror experience that would focus on engaging players emotionally instead. Development was as rocky as it could be. The game's director, Keiichiro Toyama, had never directed a game before or even seen many horror movies. The original sound director left and was instead replaced by Akira Yamaoka, who created much of the music completely separate from the game. Takayoshi Sato, an unrespected artist that was new to the company, constantly battled Konami to have his work credited and be given more tasks for development, eventually sleeping in the office every night as he rendered the game's animated cutscenes. But behind all the turmoil, the devs were passionate about creating an artistic, meaningful game that would stand the test of time, whether or not Konami or anyone else asked for it. And for all their effort, it actually worked. Silent Hill begins with the player character, Harry Mason, taking his daughter Cheryl to the vacation town of Silent Hill. On his way into town, he swerves to avoid a girl on the road, crashing and losing consciousness. Upon waking up, he realizes Cheryl is missing and heads into the fog-filled town to find her. We then get a terrifying intro sequence that perfectly demonstrates what players can look forward to for the rest of the game. Twisted camera angles, pixelated gore, creepy lighting, harsh industrial music, monsters, and of course, abandoned wheelchairs. This sequence perfectly condenses the Silent Hill experience, and it's one of the best game intros possibly ever. After this, we get our first dialogue cutscene, and it's definitely PS1 quality.
How do you feel?
Oh, like I've been run over by a truck. But I'm alright, I guess.
The voice acting is slow and stilted, and the writing is weirdly nonchalant for everything that's happening. Characters barely register the bizarre situations they're in, almost like they're bored. And the whole thing is scored by this really low-tempo, ethereal music, and it makes the whole thing feel like a dream. This is definitely where the Twin Peaks influence comes in, and it helps give the horror aspects even more impact by contrast. Anyways, after this you're immediately attacked by a pterodactyl. From there, the game really begins. You'll alternate between exploring the open-world town, venturing into creepy buildings, and trying to escape the hellish otherworld you're dragged into. And while there are only a handful of spots of interest in town, for a PS1 game the scope and freedom is impressive. Of course, many fans already know the story about how the PS1 couldn't actually handle the draw distance necessary for walking around a full town, which is why the developers added the fog to conceal the slow load times. And thankfully, it was a clever solution that only helped amplify the game's oppressive vibe. I don't think the town exploration parts are perfect though. I love the idea of wandering around and getting lost in an unfamiliar town, but the problem comes from the enemies you'll find in the world. While you're exploring Silent Hill, you'll come across packs of dog monsters, ape things, and the previously mentioned pterodactyls, and have to decide whether to fight or run away. The problem is these enemies respawn, and there's really no incentive to fight them without just wasting ammo, so you'll almost always want to just run away. And it really takes away from the lonely atmosphere of exploring an abandoned town if you're leading a parade of animals behind you. It's just a bit too much, and I think I would have preferred if the enemies in these sections were either way scaled back or just entirely absent. It stops being scary, it can actually just be annoying, which is probably my one big complaint about the horror in this game, even if it's a personal nitpick. The other half of this game takes place in the game's numerous buildings, including a school, a hospital, and a sewer. You'll have to fully explore and solve all the puzzles in these areas to move on with the game, which can range from obtuse to how was I even supposed to know that without a guide levels of confusion. You'll also fight unique enemies in these areas, and they're often far more creepy than the animals in town, and thankfully they don't come back after killing them, so it's actually worth it to fill them with bullets. I do actually like that you're given the option to fight every enemy though, which is something that's kind of fallen out of favor for modern horror games. While it's easy to assume not being able to defend yourself is scarier, I think giving players the choice to engage with enemies is actually more stressful. In a game like Outlast, your only option is to run and hide, but here you constantly have to ask yourself, do I have the ammo for this? Would it be easier for me to get through the area if all the enemies were gone? Should I risk losing health? These questions are what separates survival horror from just straight horror games, and helps make it a little more interesting at times. And like many PS1 games at the time, Silent Hill uses tank controls, so fighting enemies and even just moving around isn't easy. But this is another technical limitation that I think actually helps further the unique horror feeling of the game. Harry isn't a super soldier, he's just a regular guy, so of course he'd be awkward in a fight. Speaking of limitations, the aged PS1 graphics are used to their best potential here. There's tons of gore and disturbing imagery throughout Silent Hill, but because of the limited graphics, you're never quite sure what you're looking at. Mutilated bodies are just a mess of pixels. Are the walls covered in blood or rust? Like a good book, it makes your mind fill in the details itself, which is often scarier than depicting it in perfect quality. Enhancing those lo-fi visuals is the amazing sound design. The music of Silent Hill is unlike anything else I've heard in a game, and completely transforms the experience into a visceral nightmare. Most of the time, as you explore and solve puzzles, you'll do so to creepy, ambient music, or even eerier, no music at all, which really sells the lonely feeling. In tense moments though, the music will kick up into extremely harsh, industrial sounding, it doesn't even sound like music at that point. Take a listen. When composer Akira Yamaoka first presented his score to the dev team, they actually thought the game was glitching out, which perfectly demonstrates how unnatural the music is. It perfectly fits the cold, rusted metal aesthetic of Silent Hill, especially the Otherworld, and really makes the player feel like the world violently opposes them being in it. Alongside the terrifying music, the sound design is also top-notch. The radio is pretty genius, alerting players to when enemies are nearby, which, when combined with the confusing camera angles, can often create tense situations where the player knows an enemy is near, but they can't see them. And I have to mention that classic siren sound when Harry transitions to the other world. There's never really an in-world explanation for it, but it's terrifying and becomes another series staple for the sheer dread it gives. The sound design really makes the world feel dynamic too, in a terrifying way. For instance, while making your way around, you might hear the sound of a window breaking, a loud bang coming from another room, or metal slamming violently behind you. It's more than I expected from such an early horror game, and it scared the crap out of me every time it happened. Silent Hill is perfectly paced in a way to never make you feel at ease in your surroundings, and you're constantly being thrown in different directions. Just as you start to grow familiar with the city, you'll have to enter a building that's creepily silent and claustrophobic. Then, as you begin to unwrap the mysteries of that place and become more comfortable with it, you're dragged into the otherworld version of that area. Now you'll find yourself longing to return to something as creepy as an abandoned hospital just for some sense of normalcy. Finally, you'll be brought back to that world only to think, wait, why did I want to come back here again? And then it's out to explore another section of town. The world of Silent Hill is unrelenting, and you'll never feel like you can let your guard down. In fact, the game itself will play tricks on you, with doors leading to impossible spaces, or elevator buttons suddenly appearing when you're not looking. While there's not too much story here, what is there is dark and twisted. The history behind the town is filled with cults, drug running, and murder, and uncovering these mysteries really feels like you're leading Harry further down into hell. Everything feels half-explained, like everyone knows what's going on but you, only increasing that feeling of isolation and dread. It's the perfect stage to both explain why things are happening and pull players in deeper. And all of these elements come together to create a unique tone that I think is unrivaled even today. The wonky controls, the retro visuals and harsh audio, the unrelenting pacing and mysterious story, they all serve to deliver an atmosphere that can still haunt players today. I've said it before, but if there's one word that epitomizes Silent Hill, it's oppressive. Somehow, this little horror game from 1999 can still give me a heavy sense of dread every time I play it. It can still put me on edge and send a shiver down my spine unlike almost anything else. So yes, Silent Hill is still as scary today as it ever was. It's a benchmark not only in horror game history, but the horror genre as a whole.